consider putting this one on ice and getting it right.
Kevin Haig.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I wish I could say it's a pleasure to take a call on this third part. I've spoken on parts 1 and 2 of this bill in the debate today, and in both of those contributions I've spoken about the fact that reorganisation, mergers in the state sector typically end up costing more than is expected and typically fail to deliver the gains that were anticipated. That's not just simply a risk of doing that kind of thing, it's the usual experience. The usual experience that actually the financial gain is not there and that a critical loss of momentum in the performance of the functions of the entity occurs, quite commonly in both entities that are being merged. So I think that's a big problem in this case, because the only case that has been made for the change that government intends here is about increased efficiency, a cost saving in back office functions. Well, for goodness sake, Mr. Chair, the Charities Commission is a tiny entity, and so its merger into the Department of Internal Affairs has, even in the most optimistic scenario, a very, very small gain. And that gain is extremely likely to be outweighed by the cost of that change and a critical loss of momentum. So, given that the potential upside is tiny, what about the cost? And so, like Chris Hipkins, I'm a bit confused by government's inconsistent approach to decisions in this area, because it seems to have a confusing attitude towards the state sector. Because in this move, it is taking a step which is in a 180-degree contrast to its usual approach to the performance of the role of government. Ordinarily, National is the party of smaller government, trying to keep government out of the lives of citizens and make it as small as it possibly can. And I usually disagree very heartily with that. But in this case, here we have an institution, the Department of Internal Affairs, that's at the very core of the executive part of the government sector, actually being added to by something that's on the very fringe. And so that's important, because what's occurring here, in contrast to other parts of this bill, is that government is wading, apparently heedlessly, into an area around of constitutional arrangements, because it's of fundamental importance that we have in this country a state sector, a private or business sector, and a community sector that have separation from each other, and the arrangements that govern the interfaces between those three sectors have arisen over a considerable period of time and ought not to be done away with without very considerable thought. And so the third sector, or community sector, and I prefer those terms, I must say, to the charitable sector, but charitable perhaps at least gives a hint about the history of this, that actually these organisations, this sector has come about largely independent of government. And so government's interface with that sector is an issue of considerable sensitivity to those within the sector. And the creation of the Charities Commission in the first place occurred through very considerable consultation with the community sector organisations. And so what we are about to do, sir, is to disestablish that institution that was brought about through consultation with the sector, and we're going to disestablish it in the face of consultation that shows pretty uniformly opposition to that change from the community sector. So it's of course appropriate for the state to have some institution that manages its side of the interface between the government and community sectors. It's entirely appropriate. But the community sector is saying extremely clearly that it wishes that institution to be at some distance from the core state. Mr. Chair.
Kevin Haig.
And not right at the very heart of the core as the Department of Internal Affairs is. That is why the community sector in its many submissions on this part of the bill was pretty uniformly opposed to what government intended to do. So what we're experiencing here is a change that has, even in the very most optimistic scenario, a tiny upside, and on the downside we see a very, very likely cost blowout, but also a disruption of the basic arrangements between the state and the community sectors. And so that is why members of this House, and I'm sure it's not just us, are being exposed to the expression of considerable disquiet from the community sector. And I just want to mention a letter that I received from Greenpeace about this and quote a little bit from their letter, because they reference some basic misunderstandings on the part of the government about what it is actually engaged in here. They say, first of all, that the proposed change illustrates a lack of understanding that charities are set up by ordinary New Zealanders to address an issue that they see in their community, and that such goodwill and initiatives do not require the involvement of a government department. Secondly, that most charities receive no direct funding from government, so the responsibility is to their members and their community, not government. Thirdly, the Department of Internal Affairs involvement is likely to dampen initiatives in the community rather than encourage them. And fourthly, that the proposed change is out of step with government's own policy push around better public services. It will instead lead to more bureaucracy and lower innovation. So that is typical of the kind of feedback that Parliament is receiving from the community sector, the sector that is to be managed and controlled by this new institution. And that, sir, ought to give everyone pause for thought. It is the wrong thing for this Parliament to be doing, and I hesitate in saying this, but I would very much like to hear from the Honourable Peter Dunn in this debate, because the leader of the United Future Party campaigned on one thing, and I understand is intending to vote for this ridiculous part of the government's bill. I believe that the community and the community sector would very much like to hear from Mr Dunn as to his reasons for that change. Of course, the bill is intended to be split into three parts, and there will be another opportunity for Mr Dunn to vote against it at third reading, and I certainly hope that he chooses to take up that opportunity. In the meantime, sir, this is a part of the bill with negligible upside and very considerable downside, both in the obvious and explicit terms of extra cost and loss of efficiency, loss of momentum, but also implicitly in disruption of the constitutional arrangements between the state and the community sectors. Those arrangements have come about through history and tradition and a lot of hard-won gains, and they ought not to be set aside so lightly as this government intends.
Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Chairman, I want to reinforce